When an army is ordered to fight to the last man, the gravity of that decision takes on an entirely new meaning. For the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, this wasn't a mere theory, it was a horrific reality. Encircled by Soviet forces, starving and freezing, and yet denied the option of surrender, their fate was sealed. But the tale doesn't end with their demise. What about the Soviet soldiers who stood their ground against impossible odds? What about the civilians who were caught in the deadly crossfire? The Battle of Stalingrad was more than just another war story, was a fight for survival at its bleakest. Welcome back, everyone. It's good to have you with us again. If you enjoy these deep dives into history, leave a like, comment where you're tuning in from, and share what your dream is in life. Take a deep breath, settle in, and join me as we take a stroll through one of the most harrowing chapters of history. Why would Hitler risk everything for a city like Stalingrad? After all, it was just one city, right? But to him and Stalin, it was so much more than that tit was a symbol. To Hitler, capturing a city named after his enemy would have been the ultimate propaganda victory, a way to humiliate Stalin publicly and broadcast to the world that Soviet resistance was hopeless. For Stalin, losing Stalingrad wasn't just about a name, it was a matter of pride. It wasn't just his name on the map, it was the spirit of the Soviet Union itself. The city's fate was a reflection of Soviet strength and resilience. Strategically, Stalingrad was a valuable prize. Sitting on the Volga River, it was more than just a line on a map. The Volga was a lifeline and artery connecting the east and west of the Soviet Union. Every supply convoy, every shipment of food, weapons, and reinforcements flowed through this vital waterway. If Hitler's forces captured Stalingrad, they would effectively cut off this lifeline, crippling the Soviet war effort. But Stalingrad wasn't just a strategic goal, it was a stepping stone to something even more valuable. The oil-rich Caucasus. Oil was the fuel of modern warfare, and the German war machine was running dangerously low. But, as often happens with Hitler, practicality took a back seat to obsession. Initially, Germany's plan, known as Operation Blue, focused on securing the oil fields of the Caucasus. Stalingrad was just a secondary target, an afterthought, that changed when Hitler became fixated on the idea of capturing Stalingrad. He saw it as a symbolic victory, so important that he was willing to risk everything for it. He ordered his generals to split their forces, pursuing both the oil fields and the city at once, a decision that stretched resources thin and created dangerous gaps in his defenses. It was like trying to build two skyscrapers with enough materials for just one. Something had to give. And despite his generals' warnings, Hitler pushed forward. Stalingrad had to fall, no matter the cost. This obsession played perfectly into Stalin's hands. He knew the city couldn't be lost, not just for its strategic value, but because of its symbolic power. To prevent any retreat, Stalin issued Order No. 227, which became known as Not One Step Back. Every soldier was ordered to hold their position. Anyone who failed would face court-martial and, in many cases, execution. It was harsh, yes, but it worked. Soviet troops fought with the knowledge that there was no other option. They couldn't afford to retreat. There was no safety net, and the civilians, they were not spared. Stalin refused to evacuate the people of Stalingrad. He believed their presence would inspire the soldiers to fight harder. It wasn't just a matter of military strategy, it was psychological warfare. Civilians endured constant artillery shelling, bombings, and sniper fire as their city became a battleground. Some even took up arms themselves, fighting alongside the Red Army in their own neighborhoods and factories. Stalingrad was no longer just a city, had become a fortress, a battleground where survival was the only goal. But it wasn't just a battle between soldiers. The war of words was just as intense. On one side, Hitler believed that taking Stalingrad would lift German morale and prove to the world that the Axis powers were unbeatable. On the other side, Stalin turned the city into a symbol of Soviet strength. It wasn't just about holding ground, it was about sending a message. For Hitler, losing Stalingrad would be a public humiliation. He couldn't afford to be seen as weak, and so, despite the logistical nightmares, he pressed on. But the obsession with Stalingrad, while not without some strategic merit, was also a huge gamble. The city had a major industrial capacity. Factories there were producing vital weapons and war materials. But the German forces were already stretched thin, and as they pushed deeper into Stalingrad, their supply lines grew more and more vulnerable. The Germans found themselves caught in a logistical nightmare, unable to properly supply their troops. The further they advanced into Stalingrad, the harder it became to keep their soldiers fed, armed, and motivated. This would become their undoing. Meanwhile, the Soviet forces weren't sitting idle. At first, they were overwhelmed by the full might of the Wehrmacht. They had to retreat and regroup. But Stalin's patience paid off. Unlike Hitler, who couldn't afford to lose Stalingrad, Stalin understood the importance of trying. His generals executed a strategy of delay, stalling the German forces, forcing them to commit more and more resources into the battle. Every street the Soviets lost was a street the Germans bled to take. The deeper the Germans pushed, the more they found themselves locked into the city. It was like quicksand. Moving forward was just as disastrous as trying to retreat. German confidence had been built on their ability to carry out lightning-fast victories. But Stalingrad was not a battlefield, it was a grinder. Every building, every block, every piece of rubble became a position to fight over. The Germans had committed so heavily to the city that they couldn't just pull out when things started going south. Hitler refused to allow it, and so Stalingrad became a trap the Germans had set for the Soviets, but one they found themselves caught in. Every decision made from that point on was a reaction to the last disaster. The Germans continued to pour resources into a battle they couldn't afford to lose, even as it became more and more obvious that victory was out of reach. The Battle of Stalingrad was a test of endurance, and in the end, it was a test they failed. This battle wasn't just about strategy, it was about pride, obsession, and the human cost of war. Stalingrad became a symbol, but it was also a grim reminder of what can happen when strategy is overshadowed by symbolism. For the German Sixth Army, it was a fight they couldn't win, no matter how hard they tried. For the Soviets, it was a battle they couldn't afford to lose. And for the civilians caught in the middle, it was a daily struggle for survival in a city that had stopped being a city. It had become a war zone, one that would claim the lives of hundreds of thousands and forever change the course of the war. Wave after wave of bombers soared relentlessly over the city, unleashing more than 1,000 tons of explosives in a calculated attempt to crush the spirit of Stalingrad. What had once been a bustling industrial center by the Volga River was now transformed into an unrecognizable wasteland in mere hours. Buildings were reduced to rubble, homes were consumed by fire, and in the ensuing chaos, an estimated 40,000 innocent civilians perished. To the Germans, this was supposed to be the breaking point of Soviet resistance. Instead, they unknowingly created the perfect battleground for urban warfare, a nightmare of debris and ruins, where tanks were nearly useless, and every street corner held the potential for a deadly ambush. As the dust from the bombing began to settle, what was left of Stalingrad barely resembled a city anymore. Wide avenues were choked with the remnants of shattered buildings, obstructing any possible movement. Factories, once the beating heart of the war effort, were now mere skeletons of their former selves. The factories that had once churned out tanks and weapons lay hollow and abandoned. The rail yards, essential for moving supplies, had been twisted into a mass of bent steel and broken rubble. And yet, within this terrible destruction, the Soviets saw a chance to regroup, to fight back. They saw the ruins as a shield, a weapon, and, paradoxically, a home. The defenders of Stalingrad turned the bombed-out apartments into makeshift bunkers, filling the gaping windows and doorways with machine guns. Sniper teams were cleverly hidden in basements or perched on broken beams of abandoned buildings. Every collapsed wall, every pile of bricks became another position to hold, another deadly trap to spring on the advancing Germans. The fighting was no longer confined to traditional warfare. Soldiers and civilians alike had to adapt to this urban hellscape where every inch of ground, every single standing structure, became a point of contention. For the soldiers on both sides, this was a new, unforgiving kind of warfare. The Germans had built their reputation on the effectiveness of blitzkrieg, swift, coordinated attacks that dominated open terrain. However, Stalingrad shattered that strategy. The mighty panzer tanks, once the symbol of German might, found themselves idle, unable to move through the narrow, debris-strewn streets. Their vast size and weight rendered them useless in the claustrophobic confines of the ruined city. The artillery pieces that had been essential for clearing a path in open terrain were now ineffective against a city already reduced to rubble. What had started as a quick, decisive strike turned into a drawn-out, brutal battle for survival. Instead of sweeping frontal assaults, the German troops were forced to fight their way through a city that had become a massive maze of destruction. Every building, every floor, every room had to be cleared carefully and systematically. German soldiers, once confident in their overwhelming firepower and technological superiority, now found themselves in a battle of attrition that drained their morale, their energy, and their patience. Buildings, once filled with workers and bustling with the noise of industry, changed hands multiple times in a single day. A German soldier would charge up one staircase, only to retreat down another as Soviet defenders counterattacked. The Germans, unprepared for such a brutal and exhausting style of warfare, found themselves caught in an endless cycle of advance and retreat, room by room, floor by floor. Every inch of progress was met with fierce resistance, and the sense of frustration grew with each passing hour. Ambushes were a constant threat. The Soviets took full advantage of the terrain, hiding tanks among the rubble, waiting for unsuspecting German soldiers or vehicles to pass by before opening fire. Traps were set in alleyways, abandoned stores, and basements, using whatever the defenders had available: grenades, explosives, and even the element of surprise. The Germans, who had once relied on the power of their tanks and artillery, found themselves at the mercy of the very rubble they had created. Their confidence in superior equipment was undermined by the sheer adaptability and resourcefulness of their enemies. Civilians, too, were part of the battle, though rarely by choice. Many, had been unable to evacuate before the bombing began, and they were now trapped in the city's ruins. Some had no choice but to hide in basements, digging makeshift shelters beneath collapsed homes, enduring the daily bombardment and sniper fire just to survive another day. Others, driven by necessity or patriotism, volunteered to fight, handing rifles to neighbors or barricading windows with their families. Entire families took up arms, becoming part of the desperate resistance against the German invaders. But not all were so fortunate. As the battle raged on, countless civilians became the tragic collateral damage of a war fought with little regard for innocence. With each passing day, entire neighborhoods disappeared into the chaos of combat, swallowed by the relentless destruction. A single square foot of ground could be held by the Germans in the morning, only to be reclaimed by the Soviets by nightfall. And then, as the dawn broke again, the battle would start once more. The constant shifting of the front lines, the confusion, and the toll on the people caught in the middle made the situation seem increasingly hopeless. The strain of the fighting was not limited to the soldiers. The constant noise of artillery, the sound of buildings collapsing, the cries of the wounded all of it frayed the nerves of those involved. The Germans, particularly, found themselves in a constant state of frustration and exhaustion. Every new building they entered became a fresh battleground. Every new corner held the threat of death. The relentless nature of the battle wore down even the most hardened soldiers. They were no longer fighting a war, they were fighting for survival in a shattered city that no longer bore any resemblance to the bustling industrial hub it had once been. As the bitter Russian winter drew nearer, the conditions in the city worsened, making the battlefield even more deadly. The cold was a new enemy. By late 1942, the temperature had dropped to as low as -30 degrees Celsius, a bone-chilling cold that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Imagine a vast, frozen landscape with the eerie stillness of the ruins broken only by the howling winds. Every breath you took turned to frost on your scarf, if you were lucky enough to have one. The frigid air seeped into every crack, every corner, turning the already hellish city into an even more inhospitable place. For the Germans, this was a cruel wake-up call. They had built their entire campaign on the assumption that they could blitz through Soviet territory before the weather could turn. But the Russian winter had other plans. The German soldiers, ill-prepared for the harsh conditions, found themselves trapped in a frozen city with no way to escape the cold. Their uniforms, designed for the milder climates of Western Europe, offered no protection against the brutal frost. Soldiers wore thin, inadequate coats and boots that barely protected their feet from the snow and ice. Many resorted to makeshift survival tactics, like tearing curtains from shattered windows or stuffing hay into their clothing. But these solutions were far from sufficient. Survival hacks like these were little help when frostbite began to set in. Fingers and toes turned black and fell off. Noses and ears froze, splitting painfully. Soldiers began to lose entire limbs to the cold, while hypothermia quietly claimed victims. Some soldiers, too exhausted to stay awake, froze to death during the night. The cold didn't just kill, sapped the will to fight. The freezing temperatures turned even the simplest tasks into insurmountable challenges. A soldier struggling to aim his rifle with shaking hands was lucky if he could pull the trigger. Every step forward was a victory, but it came at a cost. In contrast, the Soviets had more experience with the Russian winter. They had fought against Napoleon under similar conditions, and their soldiers knew how to endure. They were issued proper winter gear, heavy quilted coats, felt-lined boots, and padded caps to protect their ears. They had learned to adapt to the harsh conditions, using skis to move supplies or slipping quietly through the snowy streets. While the cold still claimed lives on the Soviet side, their preparation gave them a distinct advantage over the Germans. They were able to endure longer in the freezing temperatures, and this proved to be a significant factor in the shifting tides of battle. The winter, however, didn't just freeze the bodies of the soldiers, it also froze their spirits. The relentless cold drained the will to continue fighting. The German soldier William Hoffman's words reflect this. Our strength is ebbing away. Only the dead can hope for peace now. It was the exhaustion that came with the constant battle, the bitter cold, and the despair that seemed to hang over every corner of Stalingrad. Every movement, every breath, every thought was consumed by the desire for survival, and yet the hope for peace seemed as distant as the warmth of a faraway spring. The Soviets, though not immune to the cold, were better prepared and more accustomed to fighting in these conditions. The winter became their ally, and the Germans, already isolated and struggling with supply shortages, found themselves at a severe disadvantage. The relentless freezing temperatures, combined with the endless fighting, began to break the Germans. The situation in Stalingrad had gone from a strategic military campaign to an exercise in survival against the cold and the enemy alike. Neither side was immune to the toll the brutal winter exacted, but for the Germans, it was the final blow that made their defeat inevitable. The psychological toll of the winter was as devastating as the physical. Trying to stay alive in these conditions, wondering if the next breath might be your last, was a constant strain. The sounds of distant gunfire, the howling winds, and the faint echoes of soldiers' last breath filled the air. It wasn't just about fighting the enemy anymore, it was about fighting nature itself, and in the end, it wasn't just the bombs or the bullets that killed, it was the unforgiving cold that swallowed men whole. The Russian winter was an enemy that neither side could escape, and in the end, it would prove to be as destructive as any bomb dropped from the skies. Stalingrad had been reduced to rubble, but the real battle, the one against nature itself, was just beginning. For the Germans, trapped in the frozen hellscape of a city that refused to die, victory seemed as impossible as the summer warmth they had once taken for granted. For the Soviets, the cold only made their resolve harder, pushing them to fight on in the face of every obstacle, whether it was a building, a bullet, or a winter storm. And as the days stretched into weeks and the cold grew ever colder, the battle for Stalingrad continued, a battle between man, machine, and nature itself. The German machine guns, once regarded as marvels of military efficiency, now froze solid in the merciless Russian winter. Their mechanisms stiffened with ice, rendering them useless. The soldiers, desperate to continue the fight, were forced to warm their rifles with their own hands, just to squeeze out a single shot. The same fate befell the Soviet rifles, though slightly more reliable in the freezing conditions. Even they jammed frequently, the moisture from each breath freezing in the mechanisms. Soldiers, with fingers so numb they could barely feel, fumbled desperately with ammunition, trying in vain to reload their guns. It was an agonizing process, made even worse by the biting cold that gripped every part of their bodies. The soldiers were at war with their own bodies, struggling just to maintain the most basic functions. Fighting under such conditions often meant combat at close quarters. The long-range precision and firepower that both sides had relied on were rendered meaningless in the close, cramped spaces of a destroyed city. The usual tactics of warfare, the long flanks, the coordinated artillery barrages, were impossible to carry out in the urban wasteland of Stalingrad. It was visceral, it was brutal, it was a desperate scramble to kill before you were killed. Each soldier fought with raw, primal instinct, not just to defeat their enemy, but to survive the elements. They weren't just battling the Soviet army or the German forces, they were battling the freezing temperatures that seemed intent on claiming their lives, one frostbitten finger at a time. For those few fortunate enough to find shelter in basements or dugouts, the respite was fleeting. Some lucky ones found stoves, but even those had limited fuel. The men were left to burn anything they could find, scraps of wood, pieces of broken chairs, and even books that had once been important, now burned for warmth. As each day wore on, the soldiers' bodies became more and more accustomed to the cold. Layers of frost accumulated on their uniforms, and their limbs, stiffened by the chill, felt as though they might break off at any moment. The warmth from the small fires in the dugouts offered only a temporary reprieve, not enough to thaw the soul-shattering cold of the battlefield. The city of Stalingrad had become a prison, and the soldiers were its unwilling inhabitants, held hostage by both the enemy and the merciless weather. But the cold wasn't just a silent killer. It was an active adversary, forcing soldiers to adapt in ways they had never been trained for. The freezing conditions affected every aspect of their lives. The weapons, whether German or Soviet, were designed for combat, but not for survival in such extreme temperatures. The soldiers learned to fight in conditions where the guns they relied on could fail, and ammunition could freeze solid in their hands. The horror of it all was that the real battle wasn't just for the city. The fight was against nature itself. And nature, in the form of the brutal Russian winter, was an enemy with no mercy. The frozen conditions weren't just the soldiers' enemies. They affected every part of life in Stalingrad. Dead horses, once vital to the movement of supplies, lay frozen in the streets, their bodies as stiff as the rifles they had once carried. But in the desperate struggle for survival, these horses became both food and fuel. Soldiers were forced to hack meat from their frozen carcasses, boiling it in makeshift pots in an effort to stave off hunger. They did what they had to do to survive. It wasn't a story of heroism or valor, it was a story of survival, raw and grim. The shortage of supplies quickly became a defining feature of the war in Stalingrad. The Germans, once confident in their logistical superiority, found themselves cut off. Their airdropped provisions became increasingly rare as the winds intensified, and icy runways made air missions nearly impossible. The soldiers on the ground, already fighting a cold that froze their bones, now faced the added horror of starvation. The food they had quickly froze and became inedible. Rations shrank smaller each day, and as the days turned into weeks, those same rations vanished entirely. The once proud German army, trained for blitzkrieg and overwhelming firepower, was now reduced to a sorry, starving horde, struggling for the smallest crumbs of nourishment. William Hoffmann, a young German soldier, penned entries in his diary that reflect the true horror of this situation. "We eat what we can find, even the bark from trees," he wrote. The desperation in those words is almost palpable. Imagine the indignity of chewing on bark, the cold numbing your teeth as your stomach aches with hunger, knowing that you are surrounded by enemies who could kill you at any moment. It wasn't just a war for control, it was a war for survival, and every meal, every scrap of food, became a victory. And yet the Germans weren't the only ones suffering from starvation. The Soviets, though slightly better prepared for the cold, were facing the same dire situation. Their supply lines, too, were cut off as the battle waged on winter had drained the resources of both armies, and hunger began to take its toll on Soviet soldiers as well. Thousands died of hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion. But for the Soviets, the harsh conditions weren't just a trial, they were a kind of progress. Every German soldier who fell to frostbite, to hypothermia, was one less enemy to fight. The Soviets saw the cold as an ally, weakening their invaders with each passing day. The cold wasn't just a background element, it was a constant, an unyielding force that shaped everything in Stalingrad. It didn't care who you were, what side you were on, or what your mission was. It was a killer without mercy, a foe without human form, but with an overwhelming presence that could destroy even the strongest soldiers. The frigid winds carried with them a chilling sense of inevitability. Each soldier in Stalingrad, whether German or Soviet, knew that they were caught in a deadly game with the cold. Adapt or perish. Those who couldn't survive the winter would never see the end of the battle. As the Germans advanced further into the city, their supply lines stretched too thin, and the Soviet forces, recognizing the significance of cutting those lines, pushed back fiercely. The Soviet plan was simple: isolate the Germans and starve them out. For the civilians trapped inside Stalingrad, the siege became a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. Marketplaces were destroyed, and there was no time to grow food. What little food was left was either taken by the soldiers or simply vanished as the fighting intensified. Civilians, like soldiers, had to scavenge for food, searching the rubble for anything they could eat. Some found scraps of horsemeat buried under the snow. Others were less fortunate. By the time winter's grip began to loosen, the damage inflicted by the cold had already proven catastrophic. For both the Germans and Soviets, the loss of life to the elements was staggering, though it was not the end of their torment. The freezing temperatures had taken their toll, but a new, equally cruel enemy emerged as the frozen ground thawed. Hunger. The cold may have softened, but it had already served its grim purpose, weakening the invaders and ensuring that the battle for Stalingrad would be one of attrition. For the exhausted survivors, their tattered uniforms barely keeping the biting cold at bay, the nightmare was far from over. Hunger was now their most formidable adversary. Imagine, if you can, going days without food. The gnawing emptiness in your stomach grows sharper with each passing hour. Your body, once full of energy, now betrays you. Your muscles feel heavy, your limbs weak and frail. The hunger is constant, a sharp reminder that survival is not guaranteed. As you try to fight through the desolation around you, your stomach aches, but the cold has numbed you to the point that it no longer even hurts, sits just a hollow, gnawing void that cannot be ignored. Your focus shifts from the enemy in front of you to the enemy inside your own body, ravaged by starvation. This was the new battle. Starvation, unlike the brutal clash of arms or the explosion of artillery, was quiet and relentless. It didn't stop for ceasefires or strategic pauses. Day by day, it took its toll. The German forces, already struggling with the cold, were now cut off from any supply of food. The soldiers, who had once been part of an elite military machine, able to outlast and outfight any enemy, were now reduced to the most primitive forms of survival. Desperation made them turn to the most unimaginable sources of food. Otto Zedig, a German soldier, wrote in his letters about how his comrades had begun to eat cats, those once beloved companions to many of the soldiers who had entered Russia with their minds full of glory. But now, in the face of hunger, they were nothing more than a source of sustenance. These soldiers, who had been trained in the art of warfare, were now reduced to scavenging for food in the most pitiful ways. In some of the most horrendous moments of survival, soldiers boiled strips of leather from their boots and belts, trying to extract any trace of nutrition they could from the tough, indigestible material. Leather, once a symbol of strength and durability, now became the last resort for sustenance. There are even reports of soldiers turning to eating leather straps from their equipment, boiling them in hopes of getting some semblance of warmth or sustenance. These soldiers, once proud, were now reduced to foraging like animals, scrambling for scraps of food in the snow, facing not only the enemy outside their trenches, but also the crushing despair of an enemy that gnawed at them from the inside. Hunger. The civilian population of Stalingrad was trapped in the same nightmare. Without markets or food supplies, they too were left to forage and scavenge whatever they could. There was no help, no outside aid to relieve the strain of starvation. The city had been reduced to rubble, and with no time to grow food or plant crops, the people had to rely on whatever they could find within the ruins of their city. With the battle raging on around them, even the few scraps they might have been able to find were often claimed by the fighting soldiers. Valentina Savaleva, a civilian survivor, shared her haunting recollections of eating clay. She wrote of eating dirt, hoping that it might quiet the unrelenting ache in her stomach. The image of choking down soil in an attempt to fill that hollow emptiness is both heartbreaking and terrifying. For her, and for countless others, survival was no longer a matter of avoiding enemy fire or evading a sniper's bullet. It became a matter of simply staying alive in the face of starvation. The emotional toll of this kind of desperation was equally unbearable. Could one truly remain human in such a brutal battle for survival? The struggle to find something to eat, anything, became an all-consuming obsession. Even the German soldiers, once thought to be resilient and battle-hardened, found themselves crushed by hunger. Bernard Beckler, one of the soldiers stationed in Stalingrad, wrote about hacking meat from frozen horses and boiling it just to have something, anything, to eat. It wasn't a heroic struggle, it was the bitter reality of survival. There was no glory in these actions, just a slow, agonizing fight to make it through another day. As the days stretched into weeks, the soldiers' spirits were eroded, and the proud troops of the Wehrmacht began to falter. The relentless hunger wore down their resolve. Before even entering Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army had begun to consume its horses. That wasn't the plan. They were supposed to be the invaders, the conquerors. But by the time they reached the city, they were starving. Their horses, their crucial means of transportation and sustenance, were eaten long before the fight for Stalingrad had truly begun. They were a mere reflection of the dire circumstances the army now faced. Their tactics of swift strikes, their blitzkrieg methods, had been shattered by a winter so cold, so unforgiving, that it turned every soldier into a casualty not just of war, but of nature itself. Meanwhile, the Soviet soldiers, though equally cut off from supplies, had no choice but to push on. The Soviet system did not allow for surrender. The punishment for failure was swift and brutal. Those who could not keep fighting were often executed. There was no rest, no reprieve from the fight. If hunger didn't kill you, the Soviet regime would make sure your failure did. Every Soviet soldier, no matter how frail or starving, was forced to endure. The system demanded it. Their determination, their sense of duty, became the last thing that kept them moving. But even for the Soviets, the toll of hunger was visible. The soldiers' faces became gaunt and hollow, their movements slow and labored, as the lack of food drained their strength. Starvation became a secondary enemy that they had to fight while still battling the German invaders. Starvation didn't just affect the body, it affected the mind. Hunger muddied the thinking of soldiers and civilians alike. A soldier's body might grow frail, but his mind, too, became clouded by hunger. Orders were misunderstood, confusion set in, and the battle itself became an afterthought. A soldier in Stalingrad, weak from hunger, struggled not just to survive, but to perform the most basic tasks. His rifle felt heavier with every step, his resolve weaker, his thoughts more sluggish. His ability to fight once, his most prized skill, was now eroded by the emptiness inside. A hungry soldier in Stalingrad wasn't just fighting the enemy, he was fighting himself. Each day felt like an eternity, and each step forward became harder. Soldiers, once trained to endure and to fight with precision, now struggled to lift their rifles, to move their legs, to stay awake and alert. The hunger made every action feel like a monumental task, and for the civilians, the story was no different. They didn't face bullets or bombs. Instead, they faced the slow, agonizing death of starvation. The once bustling markets of Stalingrad were now silent and ruined. There was nothing left to buy, and no way to grow food. The civilians had to rely on what little they could find within the city's rubble. The most heartbreaking images of the siege were those of civilians scavenging in the snow, picking at frozen horsemeat, hoping to find some small shred of nourishment to keep them alive. And for the people who didn't find food, they were left to die, forgotten by the world outside the city. The dead were often left unburied in the streets, their bodies slowly freezing as the rest of the city soldiered on, either too hungry or too exhausted to care. The corpses of the fallen littered the streets, some soldiers and some civilians, all victims of a battle that had turned into an endless struggle to stay alive. But even amid the suffering, the fight never stopped. Starvation became the constant presence in Stalingrad, an invisible enemy that attacked from within. In some of the darkest estimates, as many as 250,000 soldiers perished from hunger, hypothermia, and the illnesses caused by the siege's brutal living conditions. For the civilians, no one truly knows how many lives were claimed by hunger, but it's clear that the toll was immense. Starvation was no longer just an unfortunate side effect of war, it was as much a weapon as any bullet or bomb. And even with all the suffering, the fighting didn't stop. Every soldier, every civilian, was caught in a never-ending struggle to stay alive. And every new day brought more challenges, more hunger, more death. Yet, in the face of all this despair, survival remained the only rule: adapt or perish. And as Stalingrad's frozen streets became a symbol of that struggle, it wasn't just about fighting for the city, it was about fighting to simply stay alive for one more day. They were focused, deliberate, and meticulous in their attacks. Picture this: creeping through the rubble-filled streets of a city at night, where the darkness is thick enough to swallow you whole. Each step is cautious, deliberate, as you move deeper into a labyrinth of destruction. You can barely make out the figures of your enemies, and yet the threat is omnipresent. The city is a maze of buildings and shadows, and around every corner could be a German soldier, some armed with flamethrowers, These were the terrifying conditions under which Soviet squads operated, were tasked with clearing one street, one building, and sometimes even one room at a time. They advanced with calculated precision, knowing that survival depended on their ability to move silently and strike swiftly. The Germans, however, were far from helpless in this chaotic environment. They adapted too, but often too little, too late. A building that was too fortified to storm directly would be set ablaze. The sheer horror of watching the walls turn to flames. There is perhaps nothing more terrifying in warfare than facing a soldier armed with a fire-spitting weapon capable of reducing everything in its path to ash in a matter of seconds. The very idea that the enemy could burn you alive at any moment was enough to haunt anyone's thoughts. Still, as terrifying as these high-tech weapons were, they couldn't erase the daily reality of urban combat, where survival often depended more on creativity than on the equipment at hand. They learned to adapt and make the environment work to their advantage. Then, with deadly accuracy, they would ambush the unsuspecting patrols at point-blank range. This kind of guerrilla warfare was brutal, unrelenting, and highly effective in the urban battlefield of Stalingrad. Meanwhile, the Germans, ever cautious, began to inspect every door and window for hidden booby traps. The threat of tripwires connected to explosives became a constant danger. The streets of Stalingrad were no longer places of movement. They were death traps, waiting to spring into action. Every door that creaked open, every window that was pushed aside, could potentially trigger a lethal blast. For the soldiers, movement through the city became a slow and deliberate process. Each step considered, each corner approached with hesitation. Rushing was not an option. Any rush could mean death. It wasn't just about surviving the bullets and bombs. It was about making sure your next move didn't end your life prematurely. Then there was the sniper war. This wasn't just a game of cat and mouse, it was a deadly chess match. Both sides deployed snipers, but it was the Soviets who would become infamous for their precision. And no name stands out more than Vasily Zaitsev. A master marksman, Zaitsev had an astonishing 225 confirmed kills during the Battle of Stalingrad. Imagine this, crawling into position, every muscle in your body tense, knowing that one wrong move could mean death. Lying perfectly still for hours in snow and rubble, your breath barely visible in the cold air, waiting for your target to make the slightest mistake. It was a test of patience, endurance, and nerves. For the German patrols, this wasn't just about trying to spot snipers in the distance. It was about surviving the mental and psychological weight of knowing that you were being watched, hunted every moment. You could never truly relax. Every step you took was under the scrutiny of a deadly eye. It was about knowing that your every movement might be your last. A single careless step into an open street, a second of vulnerability as you stepped into a less concealed position. This could mean a bullet in your skull. A sniper's job wasn't just to shoot, it was to get into position and wait for hours. It was not only the risk of death from the bullet, but the suffocating pressure of knowing that you were being hunted by a ghost, someone who could be anywhere, invisible, but always watching. For the Germans, it wasn't just the threat of death, it was the gnawing realization that no matter where they went in Stalingrad, there was always someone aiming at them, just waiting for the slightest mistake. The very buildings and ruins that once housed civilians and workers now became deadly cover for combatants. The rubble, which had once been part of the city's infrastructure, became part of the soldiers' armor, protecting them from bullets, but also isolating them from any sense of normality. Every corner, every alley, every shattered building turned into a sniper's nest, a place where the laws of warfare were bent and survival became the only objective. It was fought by the very streets and buildings of Stalingrad. The city became an extension of the battlefield, every inch contested, every building a fortress, every piece of rubble a battleground. The urban landscape itself became a weapon in the hands of both the Soviet and German forces. The very design of the city turned it into a maze of destruction where no one was safe, and survival depended on who could adapt to the chaos. The streets that once served as a means of commerce and connection now served as corridors of death. In the midst of this madness, there was one critical truth. This war was not just about survival on the battlefield, it was about survival in the city. The physical toll of combat was grueling, but it was the psychological weight of urban warfare that took the most toll on the soldiers. Victory wasn't just about the triumph of one side over the other. It was about who could endure the longest, who could hold their ground without breaking. The longer the battle dragged on, the harder it became to maintain that resolve. The rules of engagement had changed. This wasn't just a war of strategy and tactics anymore. It was a war of attrition, where the human spirit was the last line of defense. It was no longer about grand victories or strategic conquests. And then there were the moments of utter chaos, where plans and strategies disintegrated completely. The Soviets famously fortified the railway yard in Stalingrad, which changed hands multiple times in a single day. Imagine that for a moment, fighting tooth and nail to claim a single stretch of ground, only to lose it hours later, only to fight for it again. For the soldiers, victories were fleeting, and the cost of each one was devastating. Neither side had the resources or manpower to hold positions for long, but they both kept coming back, grinding each other down, inch by inch, day by day. And in the middle of it all, luck played a decisive role. Survival often came down to whose grenade detonated first, whose rifle jammed at the wrong moment, or who found shelter just in time. Soldiers couldn't afford to think of battles in grand strategic terms anymore. Victory wasn't the goal, it was just about staying alive a little longer than the other side. For the Germans, this kind of fighting exacted a toll they weren't prepared for. They weren't just at war with the Red Army, they were at war with exhaustion, frustration, and a battlefield that seemed to favor the Soviets at every turn. Their equipment, once their greatest strength, became a burden. Tanks, planes, artillery, they meant little in the narrow, rubble-strewn streets of Stalingrad. The Germans were struggling to adapt, while the Soviets, growing stronger by the day, became more inventive and determined to hold their ground. Stalingrad didn't invent urban warfare, but it certainly redefined it. It showed the world how a city could swallow armies whole, turning the tools of modern warfare into dead weight. As the battle neared its climax, Stalingrad had stopped being a city. It had become a graveyard for grand ambitions and misguided strategies. But something even greater was looming. While German soldiers fought for survival on the ground, the Soviets were weaving a plan that would spring a trap the Germans were too distracted to see coming. What happens when an entire army gets surrounded with no way out? For the German Sixth Army, this began on November 19, 1942, with a sound that would haunt them forever: the roar of artillery fire. The Soviets had launched Operation Uranus, their long-planned counteroffensive, and the Germans were caught completely off guard. But this wasn't just another firefight in the ruins of Stalingrad. Here's how the Soviets managed it. Rather than attacking the heavily fortified German positions head-on, which would have been a pointless struggle. They focused on the weaker flanks. These weren't defended by elite German soldiers, but by Axis-Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops. These forces were poorly equipped, undertrained, and had already been worn down by the brutal conditions. They stood no chance against the Soviet assault. The Soviets came in waves, not just with infantry, but with tanks, mechanized infantry, and artillery, overwhelming the defenders in a matter of days. By November 20th, the two pincers of the Soviet attack were closing in. The encirclement known as the Kessel, or Cauldron, was complete. Inside it were roughly 300,000 Axis troops. This number didn't just include the German Sixth Army, but also elements of the Fourth Panzer Army and their remaining Romanian allies. Stalingrad was a symbolic prize, a city named after his greatest enemy. Losing it would shatter the image of German dominance. So, instead of retreating, Paulus was ordered to hold his ground. They wanted to pull the troops back westward and link up with other German forces. But in one of the most catastrophic decisions of the war, Hitler refused. For him, retreat wasn't just an option, it was a humiliation. Stalingrad was a symbolic prize, a city named after his greatest enemy. Losing it would shatter the image of German dominance. So, instead of retreating, Paulus was ordered to hold his ground. On January 31st, 1943, General Paulus, now promoted to Field Marshal, likely as a desperate attempt to pressure him into fighting to the death, finally surrendered. He became the first German field marshal to ever surrender to an enemy army. By February 2nd, the Battle of Stalingrad was officially over. The numbers were staggering. Around 300,000 Axis troops had been encircled. In November, by the end of the battle, only about 91,000 soldiers remained alive to be taken prisoner by the Soviets. Most of them wouldn't survive the brutal march to Soviet labor camps. For Hitler, the defeat was nothing short of catastrophic. The loss of an entire army, one of his most experienced, at that, was bad enough. But the real damage lay in the psychological blow. The myth of German invincibility, which had been carefully crafted and spread through Nazi propaganda, was utterly shattered. Even Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda himself, couldn't spin this disaster into anything remotely resembling a victory. Meanwhile, the Soviets had achieved their most significant triumph of the war so far. Operation Uranus wasn't just a military success, it was a masterstroke of strategy that exploited German arrogance and destroyed the Wehrmacht's momentum. The encirclement of the Sixth Army wasn't merely the downfall of one of Germany's most powerful forces. It marked a turning point for the entire war. The Soviets had proven they could match and defeat the Germans, not just with sheer numbers, but with strategy, determination, and a level of resolve that the Germans hadn't anticipated. From that moment on, the tide of war began to shift. The German forces, once so dominant, were now forced into a retreat they would never recover from. For the first time in this brutal conflict, the unthinkable had happened. Nazi Germany had admitted defeat. This wasn't just a setback in some minor skirmish. This was Stalingrad, the battle Hitler had fixated on, pouring hundreds of thousands of men into its ruins and declaring it a prize too important to lose. And yet, the Germans lost not just the territory, but something far more significant: the myth of their invincibility. The surrender at Stalingrad struck a devastating blow, leaving scars as deep as the destruction on the city itself. Before Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht carried an aura of inevitability. Their lightning-fast invasions had shattered Poland, France, and much of Europe. Even as they pushed deeper into Soviet territory, victory still seemed like an inescapable fact of time. To those under Nazi rule and anyone watching from afar, Germany seemed unstoppable. But Stalingrad shattered that perception forever. By February of 1943, with General Paulus' surrender, it became painfully clear that Nazi Germany could bleed. The Wehrmacht was not limitless. Its soldiers weren't unbreakable, and its leaders, as much as they projected strength, were not infallible. The loss of Stalingrad proved that even the mighty German war machine could collapse under the right conditions. It was a devastating realization that resonated far beyond the battlefield. The shock wasn't confined to the war zone. News of the surrender sent ripples through the German population. Until this point, Nazi propaganda had painted the war as an uninterrupted string of victories. The German people were fed a steady diet of triumphs, stories of disciplined soldiers marching to glory, of victories that seemed to roll in one after another. But Stalingrad was a different story. It was too monumental, too catastrophic, too impossible to spin into anything positive. Even Goebbels, the master of Nazi propaganda, struggled to avoid the truth. He admitted, begrudgingly, that the defeat had deflated the German people, a statement that spoke volumes. If Goebbels was struggling to mask the cracks, then imagine how deep they truly were. For many Germans, Stalingrad was the moment the war shifted from bold victories to desperate survival. The morale at home began to crumble. Families who had already been dreading each knock at the door, each letter confirming that their loved ones wouldn't return, now faced the brutal reality that the war might not end in victory. The myth they had clung to, the belief in a Germany that could conquer anything and anyone, began to die within the ruins of a city far away on the Volga River. This psychological toll was not just confined to the German borders. For the Soviets, the victory at Stalingrad wasn't just a military achievement, it was an enormous morale booster. Until then, much of the war had seen the Red Army on the defensive, struggling to fend off relentless German advances as cities and territories fell into Axis hands. Stalingrad flipped that narrative. It demonstrated not only that the Soviets could hold their ground, but that they could strike back with unmatched tenacity and strategy. The Germans had often underestimated their Soviet counterparts, but the Battle of Stalingrad proved them wrong. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered, and in its place, a new sense of purpose was born in the Soviet ranks. This was no longer about just survival. It was about victory, and the Battle of Stalingrad wasn't just the destruction of an army or the fall of a city. It was the collapse of an idea that had driven the war for years. The myth of the German war machine as an unstoppable force had been obliterated. For the Soviets, it wasn't just a military victory. It was a moment when the impossible became possible. The entire world now knew that Stalingrad had marked a turning point, a moment when the war's fate had begun to shift in favor of the Allies. The Germans, once poised for victory, would now be forced into retreat after retreat, and the Soviet Union, though battered and broken, had proven it could stand strong. Stalingrad wasn't just a military battle, it was the battlefield of ideas, of morale, of myth and truth. It was a city that refused to die, even as the world around it crumbled. And in the end, it wasn't just the Germans who lost, everyone lost. For the Germans, the battle broke their spirit and shattered the myth that they had built. For the Soviets, it was the victory they so desperately needed, a victory that would fuel their resolve for the remainder of the war. For the world, it was the moment history's path began to change. This is where things went from bad to worse. Hitler promised Paulus that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, would resupply the encircled troops by air. The promise was that essential supplies like food, ammunition, and medical aid would be airlifted daily to sustain the army. At least, that was the plan. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, made bold claims that his squadrons could deliver 300 tons of supplies to Stalingrad every day, just enough to keep the Sixth Army functioning and to bolster morale. Göring's assurances, however, weren't based on military facts or experience. They were based on wishful thinking, a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of the German effort in Stalingrad. The reality was far bleaker. The Luftwaffe's attempts to resupply the encircled Sixth Army were disastrous from the start. The German Air Force was simply not equipped to handle such a vast logistical operation. They struggled to deliver even a third of what was promised. Instead of 300 tons, the Luftwaffe barely managed to deliver around 80 tons of supplies per day, less than a third of what was necessary to sustain an army trapped in one of the coldest, most brutal winters in history. The planes that made it through the Soviet air defenses were often shot down by Soviet fighters or anti-aircraft guns. Those that did land were lucky to bring anything useful: summer clothing, luxury items, and medical supplies that were practically useless in the freezing conditions. It was like throwing a bucket of water on a roaring inferno. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't stop the devastation that was quickly unfolding inside the cauldron. Inside the encirclement, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Supplies of food had completely run out, and the soldiers, driven to the brink of starvation, resorted to boiling leather for soup. Imagine that, boiling the very materials meant for boots and equipment in a futile attempt to extract any remaining nutrients. It wasn't just hunger, it was a gnawing, unrelenting emptiness that seemed to seep into their very souls. The soldiers were losing not just their strength, but their will to continue. They had become mere shells of the men they once were, fighting not for victory, but for survival in the most primal sense of the word. Ammunition was in short supply as well. For the soldiers on the front lines, it wasn't about firing powerful weapons or using artillery, it was about desperation. Using bayonets and knives in hand-to-hand combat just to survive the next wave of attacks. It wasn't the well-equipped, well-trained soldiers of the early campaigns, it was the desperate men who had nothing left but their will to hold on a little longer. As winter deepened, the cold became another silent killer. Temperatures dropped to deadly lows. Soldiers huddled together for warmth, their breaths visible in the frigid air, but the clothing they had, if they had any clothing left, was woefully inadequate for the brutal conditions. Thin uniforms offered no protection against the biting cold, and their hands became stiff with frostbite. Imagine trying to shoot, reload, or hold a weapon when your fingers were numb, each breath a struggle, your skin burning with the cold. The situation inside the cauldron wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, too. As the days wore on, many soldiers began to lose their sense of hope. They weren't just fighting the Red Army anymore, they were fighting the very elements, and fighting the realization that they were trapped with no way out. The morale of the troops was at an all-time low. Each day they woke up to the same hellish reality: the incessant cold, the hunger, the lack of ammunition, and the constant threat of death. For the German soldiers, it was a war on all fronts, not just the Red Army, but the elements, their own bodies, and the crushing weight of helplessness. The hope of a rescue dwindled by the day, and the prospect of escape seemed as distant as ever. Though the German High Command scrambled to organize a possible breakout or relief effort, nothing materialized in time. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, spearheaded Operation Winterstorm, a counteroffensive designed to break through the Soviet lines and reach the encircled Sixth Army. The idea was to punch a hole in the Soviet defenses and provide a lifeline to Paulus and his men. But while his forces made some progress, they were never able to break through. The Soviets, having anticipated this move, had already fortified their positions. With each attempt by the Germans to relieve the Sixth Army, the Soviets had a response ready, reinforcing their lines and ensuring that the encirclement remained intact. As the days turned into weeks, the situation for the Sixth Army became even more dire. The cold, hunger, and disease weren't the only threats. The psychological toll of being trapped in the cauldron was unbearable. The realization that there was no way out, no hope of reinforcements, and no escape from the inevitable death and destruction that awaited them weighed heavily on every soldier. Paulus, fully aware that they were running out of time, desperately asked for permission to abandon Stalingrad and attempt to break out of the encirclement with whatever strength his men had left. This was a last-ditch effort to save what remained of the Sixth Army. But in one of the most inflexible and costly decisions of the war, Hitler refused. His command was clear: no retreat. The Sixth Army was to hold out to the bitter end, no matter the cost. By the end of January 1943, the situation had become a nightmare. The Sixth Army wasn't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting for the most basic of things: survival. They weren't concerned with strategic gains or military objectives. They were concerned with enduring another hour, another day, and hoping for a miracle that would never come. The food supplies had been exhausted long ago. Men who were once powerful soldiers now lay diseased and dying in trenches, unable to do more than wait for the inevitable. Every day, thousands of soldiers surrendered to the Soviets, too weak, too disillusioned, or too mentally shattered to continue the fight. The hope of victory had long since died, and now, the only thing left was the unrelenting struggle to stay alive just a little longer. The few that remained were shadows of their former selves, their bodies worn thin, their faces gaunt, and their eyes hollow from the hunger and hardship they had endured. Stalingrad had consumed them, body and soul. What was once an army of fearsome soldiers had been reduced to broken men, clinging to life in a city that had become a tomb for the hopes of the Axis forces. The end of the Sixth Army was inevitable. There was no grand final battle, no heroic charge to break free. It was the slow, painful death of an army trapped by their own pride, their own obsession, and their own refusal to accept the reality of their defeat. By the time Paulus finally surrendered on January 31st, 1943, the battle for Stalingrad had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The city, once a symbol of Soviet strength, had now become a symbol of German failure. The battle would go down in history as one of the most brutal, devastating, and defining moments of World War II. For the first time, the Soviets didn't just stop the Nazis, they wiped out an entire army. The victory at Stalingrad changed everything, sending shockwaves around the globe. The message was loud and clear. The Red Army wasn't just able to take on Germany, they could totally crush them. The battle became a symbol of Soviet strength and determination. Stalingrad, named after Stalin, took on everything Hitler threw its way and came out on top. This shift in momentum wasn't just felt on the Eastern Front. The entire world, especially the Allied nations, took notice. Before Stalingrad, many in Britain, the United States, and even occupied Europe had wondered if Germany could ever be stopped. But Stalingrad provided the answer. The Axis powers were vulnerable, and that realization became a beacon of hope. The battle's outcome was more than just a military success. It was a psychological blow to the Nazis and a rallying cry for the Allies. For Stalin, the propaganda impact was enormous. The victory at Stalingrad wasn't just a military achievement. It was a powerful symbol of Soviet might. With the defeat of Germany in a city named after the Soviet leader, Stalin's position was cemented. His ability to lead the Soviet Union against the seemingly unstoppable Nazi war machine was now indisputable. This victory fueled the Soviet war effort and ensured the Allies pressed harder against the Axis powers, pushing them toward an eventual victory. The Soviet victory became a rallying cry for the oppressed people of Europe, proving that the Allies could and would defeat the Nazis. This psychological impact was just as powerful as the military defeat. It was a victory that sent a clear message. The Soviet Union could endure any onslaught, and its resilience was not to be underestimated. The Allies, particularly Britain and the United States, began to see victory as something within reach. It provided the proof that Germany was not invincible, that their defeat was not just a possibility, was now a certainty. The victory at Stalingrad shifted the balance of power in the war. It reinvigorated the morale of the Allied forces and became a symbol of hope for those living under Nazi occupation. But for the Germans, it shattered their sense of invincibility. For the German military, the psychological fallout from Stalingrad was profound. Before the battle, the Wehrmacht was convinced of its superiority. Fueled by early victories, German soldiers believed they were part of an unstoppable force destined to dominate Europe. But the reality of Stalingrad destroyed that illusion. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers had been trapped, surrounded, and forced to endure starvation, frostbite, and isolation. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of Hitler's Eastern campaign, had been decimated, their confidence shattered. The survivors, who managed to escape as Soviet prisoners, faced years of captivity, many never to return home. The German soldiers, once certain of their own superiority, found themselves forced into submission. They had watched their comrades fall, faced the unrelenting cold, and seen their supplies dwindle. But perhaps the most profound symbol of the destruction of their invincibility was the surrender of General Friedrich Paulus. Paulus had been promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler, a title that carried immense prestige. In Nazi Germany, a field marshal was expected to die in battle or take his own life rather than surrender. But in Stalingrad, Paulus defied these expectations. Instead of fighting to the death or committing suicide, Paulus chose to surrender to the Soviets, becoming a living reminder of the Wehrmacht's failure. For many German soldiers, the sight of their field marshal, one of the highest-ranking officers in the German military, capitulating to the Soviets, was a devastating blow. It was the ultimate symbol of defeat, a shattered myth of German invincibility. The surrender was not a heroic last stand. It was a collapse, a visible and undeniable failure. The sight of Paulus, once considered the embodiment of German military pride, submitting to the Soviets, signaled the end of the Nazi dream of domination. The psychological impact of this event on the German forces was immeasurable. It wasn't just the loss of a battle, it was the destruction of their belief in their own invincibility. This loss of confidence, particularly in Hitler's leadership, marked a turning point for the German military. From that moment on, the Wehrmacht was never the same. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad was more than just a military triumph, became a symbol of Soviet endurance. The city, devastated by months of fighting, was officially named a hero city, a title designed to ensure that the sacrifices made there would never be forgotten. The civilians and soldiers who endured the unimaginable suffering of the siege had shown a resilience that became ingrained in Soviet identity. The battle for Stalingrad was not just a victory over the Germans. It was a testament to the Soviet people's ability to overcome any adversity, no matter how dire. Even as Soviet soldiers fought through extreme conditions, starvation, exhaustion, and constant death, they had held firm. The Red Army, though weakened, was unyielding, refusing to give up or surrender. This spirit became a defining feature of the Soviet Union. Victory at Stalingrad was not just a matter of military strategy. It was a matter of national pride, a symbol of Soviet strength and unity. It was proof that the Soviet people could endure anything and emerge victorious. This victory would go on to shape Soviet identity for decades. It became a part of the Soviet ethos, a defining moment that emphasized the strength and resilience of the Soviet people. This collective spirit of endurance became central to the Soviet narrative of the war. In the face of overwhelming odds, the Soviet people held on. The Red Army had not only held the line, they had struck a decisive blow against the Nazi forces, changing the course of the war. For the Soviet Union, this wasn't just about survival, it was about proving to the world that they could not be defeated. Stalingrad became a powerful symbol of Soviet power, and the cost of that victory would resonate throughout history. Stalingrad was not just a military disaster for Germany, it was the undoing of a carefully constructed myth. Before the battle, the Germans had believed in their own superiority. They had been led to think that they were part of an unstoppable force, a military juggernaut that could crush anyone in its path. But Stalingrad shattered that illusion. It wasn't just a defeat on the battlefield, it was the beginning of a psychological collapse that would reverberate throughout the German army. The Sixth Army, once the pride of Hitler's Eastern campaign, marched into Stalingrad with over 600,000 men. By the time the battle ended, only 91,000 of them remained to surrender. The survivors, many suffering from frostbite, starvation, and untreated wounds, were taken prisoner by the Soviets. Most of them would never return home. Those who did were broken men, forever haunted by the horrors of what they had endured. The loss at Stalingrad was a turning point for Germany. It was the beginning of a long and brutal retreat, one that wouldn't end until the Red Army reached the gates of Berlin. But the psychological damage didn't end there. For the soldiers who had been part of that army, Stalingrad was a crushing blow to their belief in their own invincibility. The once unstoppable force was now a broken, starving horde. The myth of German superiority had been destroyed, and with it, the belief that Hitler's leadership could guarantee victory. Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, and the Allies knew it. The fall of Stalingrad proved that the Nazis could be defeated, and the world began to see the possibility of victory over one of the most dangerous regimes in history. The magnitude of the victory at Stalingrad was immense, but it came at a staggering cost. The battle was one of the deadliest of World War II, and its human toll was unimaginable. Over 2 million people fought for Stalingrad, soldiers and civilians alike. By the time the fighting stopped, the casualty count was staggering. Approximately 1.2 million lives were lost. This was not just a number. It represented real people, soldiers, civilians, men, women, and children, each with their own stories, their own lives, their own futures. Those futures were erased in the rubble of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, once the most powerful force in Europe, entered Stalingrad with over 600,000 men. By the end of the battle, only 91,000 remained. Of those who surrendered, most were broken men, plagued by frostbite, starvation, and untreated wounds. For the Germans, the surrender wasn't a victory, was the ultimate symbol of their failure. It was the collapse of their military might, the destruction of their carefully crafted myth of invincibility. The Soviet casualties were no less staggering. The Red Army had faced brutal conditions, starvation, and constant death. Yet, despite all the suffering, they emerged victorious. The cost of that victory was immense, but it proved that even the most formidable enemy could be beaten. Stalingrad became a testament to the Soviet people's resilience, their ability to endure hardship and emerge victorious, no matter the cost. For the Allies, it was proof that Nazi Germany was not invincible. The Battle of Stalingrad set the stage for the eventual defeat of Hitler's regime, but it was a victory that would be remembered not only for its strategic importance, but for the immense sacrifices made by those who fought and died in the ruins of the city. Out of the 91,000 German and Romanian soldiers taken prisoner, only a small fraction would ever return to Germany. The rest met grim fates, dying in Soviet labor camps, lost along the treacherous march out of the city, or simply vanishing without a trace, swallowed by the brutality of war. The grisly remnants of the battle lay scattered across Stalingrad. Over 250,000 bodies were recovered from the ruins, silent witnesses to the unthinkable devastation that took place in and around the city. These fallen soldiers, many of them young men who had once held dreams of victory, now lay in unmarked graves, their stories lost forever. They were more than just a number. They were people with families, loved ones, and hopes that would never be realized. But the Soviets, too, paid an incalculable price. The staggering toll taken on the Red Army left deep scars, not only physically, but emotionally. Over 478,000 Soviet soldiers were either killed or went missing during the battle, and an additional 650,000 were wounded. Many of the wounded bore injuries that would last a lifetime, frostbite and untreated wounds that robbed them of limbs or their ability to walk. Some returned home only to find themselves prisoners in their own bodies, unable to escape the horrors they had witnessed on the front lines. These were not just numbers either. They were brothers, fathers, sons, men who had left behind farms, factories, and families, only to return, if they were fortunate enough, broken by the devastation. The civilian toll was almost impossible to comprehend. Before the relentless bombings and the siege began, Stalingrad was home to around 400,000 people. By the end of the battle, fewer than 40,000 civilians were still alive. That means 9 out of 10 of the city's residents were either killed, evacuated, or simply went missing. For those who stayed behind, survival became a matter of pure chance, finding a hidden cellar to shelter in a scrap of food just in time, or perhaps simply being fortunate enough to avoid the relentless bombings that seemed to hit without warning. Even then, survival did not guarantee safety. For the survivors, the suffering did not cease when the fighting ended. The aftermath clung to them, reshaping their identities and their futures. Physically, the toll of survival was brutal and ever-present. Many soldiers and civilians alike returned home only to find themselves haunted by the scars left by the battle. Their bodies were covered with the wounds of war-missing limbs, frostbitten fingers, and toes, or the deep, unseen injuries of trauma that never truly healed. Soldiers who had fought for months in freezing conditions, with little food and even less medical care, came home marked by their experience. They carried with them more than just the memory of battle. They carried the physical and emotional burdens of survival. But the psychological toll was even more crushing. For the soldiers, the memories of Stalingrad stayed with them long after the guns fell silent. The battle had not just broken their bodies, it had shattered their minds. Imagine spending months in a city where every corner could mean an ambush, where starvation, disease, and death were constant companions, and where the ever-present fear of snipers and artillery fire left no place to hide. William Hoffmann, a German soldier, kept a diary that illustrated this descent into despair. At first, his words were filled with the kind of optimism that comes with the beginning of battle. But, as the months wore on, his tone grew darker. His references to Hitler became more distant, until the Führer was simply referred to as Hitler, a sign that even the idolized leader could no longer inspire the soldiers. Hoffmann's writing turned into a reflection of hopelessness, mirroring the psychological toll that the battle took on every person involved. For the civilian survivors, the mental scars were harder to define but no less real. How do you measure the loss of a home, a community, an entire way of life? Before the war, Stalingrad had been a thriving industrial city. It had schools, factories, bustling marketplaces, and the laughter of children playing in the streets. But after 5 months of unrelenting siege, constant bombardment, and brutal street fighting, the city was reduced to rubble. Nearly 80% of Stalingrad's buildings were completely destroyed, leaving behind only fragments of a once vibrant city. Broken walls, twisted steel, and charred wooden beams, buried beneath layers of ash and snow. For the survivors, it was as if they had been transported to a world they no longer recognized. The survivors wandered through the wreckage, trying to find shelter where none existed, trying to make sense of a city that had been erased. The memories of the old Stalingrad's streets, its buildings, its people, were nothing more than ghosts now. They were left to rebuild not just their city, but their lives from the ashes. Even when the Soviets emerged victorious, the cost of that victory was felt long after the last shots were fired. Soldiers returned home, not just physically broken, but emotionally scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. The mental toll of Stalingrad stayed with them, lingering in their dreams, haunting their every thought. But the grief of the families back home was perhaps even worse. The war was over, but the wait for news was agonizing. Wives anxiously scanned casualty lists, hoping against hope that their husbands' names would not appear. Mothers lived with the terrifying uncertainty of not knowing whether their sons were dead, captured, or still trapped somewhere in the ruins of the city. For many, the grief of not knowing was more painful than the grief of death itself. And the suffering didn't stop when the war ended. The long-term impact on the survivors, both soldiers and civilians, was profound and far-reaching. The city of Stalingrad, like the survivors, was technically rebuilt, but it was no longer the same. The post-war city bore scars that were disguised as progress. The rubble was cleared, but it was impossible to erase the memories. Decades after the battle, survivors would still stumble upon unexploded shells or massed graves while planting gardens or building roads. Stalingrad had physically recovered, but its spirit was forever marred by what had transpired. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a symbol of resilience, strength, and victory in the face of overwhelming odds. It was celebrated as a hero city, a place where ordinary men and women had fought and died to protect their homes and their families. It became a symbol not just of military triumph, but of the unwavering human will to survive, even in the most impossible of circumstances. To the rest of the world, however, Stalingrad was a warning about the true cost of war, about the human suffering that accompanies total destruction. Stalingrad was not just a turning point in the war. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the devastating consequences of war. The Battle of Stalingrad was a brutal reminder of what war demands from those who fight it and from those who are caught in its path. The cost was not just in soldiers and civilians lost, but in the lives that were forever altered by the horrors they had experienced. Over 1 million casualties, a city reduced to rubble, and a generation forever scarred. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But the price of that victory was almost beyond comprehension. Stalingrad wasn't just a battle, it was a story of survival, sacrifice, and unrelenting human suffering. It is a story that still echoes through history, a reminder of the horrors that war inflicts on individuals, families, and entire cities. For those who were there, one day was already too long. Stalingrad wasn't just a fight between armies, it was a fight for the survival of the human spirit. Take a moment to reflect on the sacrifices made by those who fought and died at Stalingrad. And if you found this journey through history compelling, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories of human resilience and the battles that shaped our world. Remember the cost of war, and never forget the price that was paid for the victory.